You're listening to Sipping on Some Crime podcast, hosted by Aaron. This podcast covers sensitive and triggering subjects, explicit language, and mature content which may not be suitable for children. As always, all parties are innocent until proven guilty.
This town was safe. Nobody locked their doors, and kids played and ran around the neighborhood freely. There has always been a small town feel with approximately 6,000 residents living in Franklin in 1971. The town referred to as the Three Rivers City is at the junction of two of those rivers, with a beautiful, quaint downtown lined with local shops and neighborhoods filled with families. Franklin seemed like the ideal place to grow up as a kid. However, that was all about to change for this peaceful New Hampshire town on November 21st, 1971. The days of unlocked doors and kids playing in the neighborhood and traveling alone to the store were over, and this town would never be the same.
This was an old cart road. A hunter coming through the area initially suspected that this was a deer carcass. This was a savage killing. It's one of the most heinous crimes that I've encountered in my 31 years of professional experience.
I think it'd be harder if I gave up. I promised her I wouldn't give up, and I'm not going to. I promised her, because I let her leave.
She was like my best friend when I was a child, and she was gone. She was taken from me. And I never got that closeness back again from anybody.
It was Friday, November 21st, 1971, and Kathy Lynn Gloddy, 13, asked her sister Karen, then 15, if she could go down to the convenience store and get potato sticks and ice cream. Karen didn't see any reason why she couldn't go, so she told Kathy it was okay. Kathy dressed in her jacket, she put on her hats, mittens, and snow boots before heading out the door with her ever-faithful companion, Tasha, her German Shepard. Kathy walked down the street to the corner store where she bought her ice cream and potato sticks she loved so much. Kathy was then seen walking across the high school parking lot by a few fellow schoolmates. Karen, her older sister, was attending a sports banquet that night on campus, and fellow classmates remember seeing Kathy looking into some windows before heading away from campus. One schoolmate remembers saying hi to her as she crossed the lawn, but says it seems like Kathy didn't hear them because she just kept walking as she headed the opposite direction of home. That was around 7:30 p.m. that night. Some speculate that Kathy might have swung by the campus knowing Karen would be there to say hi to her sister, but not finding her, she decided to leave. Later that night, Karen returned home to find Kathy hadn't been home yet. And it was late, later than Kathy would normally be out. Around 10:30 p.m., Tasha, Kathy's German Shepard, appeared outside the Gloddy home without Kathy. Kathy's mother instantly knew something was wrong. Karen recalls in an ABC interview that the dog climbed up on the doors, scratching at her door to get in, and once they let her in, she ran around the house searching for her. Kathy's mother started to assume the worst. Karen remembers telling her not to panic, but her mother knew something wasn't right. She just knew. Around 11:30 p.m., the Gloddy family phoned the police to report Kathy missing. Now you have to remember it was 1971, and back then, police officers were not under the instant assumption that if a kid is reported missing, that it is anything more than a kid running away. Most departments had a 24-hour to 72-hour window before you could report someone missing, which we know now are crucial hours of the investigation. The Gloddy family knew this was out of character for Kathy. Even when officers tried to tell Lucille, Kathy's mother, that kids do this all the time and not to be concerned yet, they were still very concerned. The officer did agree to take down a description of Kathy and told Lucille that they would pass along the information to patrol cars just in case they spotted her along their route. The family knew the officers were wrong. Kathy hadn't run away. Kathy was a sweet tomboy who was very concerned about the Vietnam War, got involved in helping local clothing drives, and had compassion for helping those in her community. She wrote very deep poetry and was just a kind-hearted girl. Karen says that Kathy was an old soul, always aware of what was happening around her and how that affected other people. This was not like Kathy. Something was wrong. It was November in New Hampshire, and it was around 25 degrees out that night, and Kathy was not dressed to be out very long. Karen says when Kathy left the house, she barely had enough money to purchase her ice cream and potato sticks, so she knew she wasn't planning on going anywhere. Kathy and Karen shared a room and were really close. Karen and her sister Ann and Janet, along with her mother and father, all immediately knew something had to be wrong. The Gloddy family made a plan to go out and look for Kathy that night. They called on friends and neighbors to help them. All night long, they searched for her. Not a family member or a close friend got any sleep that night as they canvassed the streets looking for the young girl that seemed to have vanished in just a few short hours. Family and friends spent the night walking the streets that Kathy typically would have taken home, asking passerbys and businesses if they had seen Kathy. They talked to Kathy's friends and neighbors, hoping someone would know where Kathy was. With no luck and the sun coming up, some of the family headed back home to regroup. Instead of heading back to the house with the group, Karen, Kathy's sister, decided that she just had to check the railroad tracks. They ran through the town close to the house. Maybe Kathy had decided to take that way home the night before. Karen walked, scouring the ground for a mitten, hat, anything that would point to Kathy going that way. Karen couldn't find any sign that Kathy might have gone that way, so Karen decided to head back home and see if Kathy had returned. When Karen walked up the street towards her house, she saw the police cars surrounding it. Her heart just sank. She walked up the drive and into the house. In the living room, she saw her mother sobbing hysterically and her father crying. Her sister Janet was the one to tell Karen that they had located Kathy and she had been murdered. Karen looked at Janet, shaking her head. It couldn't be true. They were confused. It had to be someone else. Karen looked up into Janet's eyes, and that's when she remembers knowing this was real. As the news really hit her, Karen can remember looking over at her mother just as the doctor who had been called over to the home gave her mother Lucille a shot to basically put her to sleep because at this point, she was so hysterical with grief. Karen walked into the kitchen, sat on the floor with her head in her hands, and just began sobbing. The Franklin police let the family know that Kathy's body had been found in the woods just a few miles away by a popular swimming spot. Hunters had discovered the body at first and thought it was a deer carcass. Kathy was identified by someone who recognized her, and that's how the police knew to contact her parents. The family would only learn through local newspaper and local news station headlines that as the weeks went on, how violent this murder was. The police in Franklin had never dealt with a murder this violent. They didn't know what they were getting into or how to properly secure the site, or even how to begin working a case like this. Franklin didn't have its own coroner, and they had to have one from Massachusetts come down to do Kathy's autopsy. They had a local doctor do a small exam right after she was found, but they needed the coroner to do a full autopsy report. The same day Kathy's body was discovered, the police would go into the room that Kathy and Karen shared and begin tossing the room looking for clues. They ripped her bedding and mattress apart, tossing aside things of Kathy's they didn't feel offered them any clues. After they were done, they walked out of Kathy and Karen's room and left it torn apart. Karen said she'll never forget how that felt. It was bad enough that she lost her sister. Her parents were devastated, and now her room that she shared with Kathy would never be the same. Any hopes of preserving her room and her belongings just like it was before any of this happened, that hope was now gone. Life as she knew it, her family's lives, had been torn apart. Nothing was ever going to be the same. The official autopsy report would reveal Kathy's cause of death to be traumatic asphyxia and multiple blunt injuries with the rupture of the liver and a fracture in the skull. Karen remembers finding out all the gruesome details of her sister's death through the sensationalized headlines that would be scrawled across the newspapers in town. The family and the whole community would learn the violence that Kathy endured that night through the press. In the few days following the discovery of Kathy's body, the press would release an article in the local newspaper stating the details on Kathy's death and about the crime scene. The Gloddy family learned that day that Kathy was found lying naked in the snow except for her knee-high socks, a detail that should have never been shared to the public about the scene. There was no victim advocates or victims' rights back then, and the press not being used to such a violent crime in their community, they didn't know or either they didn't acknowledge a protocol on what to report to the public. The following days, another article would go on to explain that after the autopsy report was done, that they determined that Kathy had been violently beaten and raped multiple times. And another news report would reveal that Kathy had been run over by a vehicle 4 times after the suspect or suspects involved in her murder attempted to conceal her body. Finding out all these gruesome details was really hard for the family, and finding them out in such a public way was even worse. Karen told ABC News, to think that she was left there, in the cold of a dark winter's night and with no clothes on, and what had happened to her, it just came crashing down. It was really hard. Karen says her parents were never the same after the murder. It was almost like they checked out. They lived day by day, but it wasn't living. It wasn't a life.
It's not what you expect especially in a little town like that. That would have been the last thing any of us would have thought of, that she had been brutally raped and murdered.
A loss of innocence for the entire city of Franklin.
Completely. I mean, none of us could go out anymore. We had to be within earshot now of our parents, and a lot of times we couldn't go anywhere without our parents.
As Franklin police began to piece together what may have happened to Kathy, the case also opened to the state investigators. The problem with multiple different departments on Kathy's case was that none of them seemed willing to share any information with one another. The public was shocked and horrified by the details of this crime, and with local papers putting out so many reports, it seems as the weeks went on in this case, it was becoming more about politics and less about Kathy's murder. DNA evidence was unheard of back then, and they didn't have the knowledge of investigating a crime scene and preserving DNA like we do today. From the reports, it seems as if Kathy's body was placed in the brush as a place to hide her body, but the actual beating and rapes took place somewhere else. With the amount of overkill involved in her murder, investigators on all sides were able to agree that this murder had to be personal. The police had some people of interest, but no solid leads or suspects, and it would remain this way for 12 years. The case was reopened again in 1983. Now the police had a more narrowed list and focused on a few people of interest, but they just couldn't get solid evidence to pursue any of these people of interest. And again, the case would go cold. As the years went on, Karen, Ann, and Janet continued to fight for Kathy. The three sisters would become her advocate. More and more tragedy would befall the family. While fighting to keep their sister's case alive, they would lose so much more. Kathy's brother Richard would later die from a congenital heart defect. Kathy's father Earl would die of cancer in 1992, and her mother Lucille would take her own life in 1997, writing a note saying she just wanted to be with Kathy, all passing without ever knowing what happened to Kathy that day or who was responsible. Karen says that after Lucille took her life, that as kids it hurt tremendously. She had to pray to forgive her, but it still hurts today. To have lost so much and for their mother to leave her other children here to suffer her loss as well, it was just too much to bear. Yet Karen, Ann, and Janet kept pushing the Franklin Police Department to continue to investigate their sister's brutal murder. During this time, Karen started to write a book about her sister's murder and the lasting and continuing impact it had on her family and her community. She says it was her way to process and to begin to heal. But this isn't a book about all the gory details of her sister's murder. Instead, this book really focuses on the family and the aftermath of losing someone violently and how that forever changes you and your family. Karen talks about how her parents just couldn't deal with Kathy's death and how it broke them, and how as a family, all of them were never okay again. Karen remembers her and her siblings would fight so hard to hide their tears from their parents, knowing they just couldn't handle thinking of Kathy and her death. She talks about still being at home and growing up in a house when your parents check out due to a tragedy, and how being a child and still needing your parent. But you knew they just couldn't be there like they were before. Karen and her siblings knew this fight for Kathy would have to be fought by them. They had to have the strength to raise her voice and demand justice. During this time, Karen and her sisters would be instrumental in getting a cold case unit established in New Hampshire. Karen wrote a second book that focuses more on the investigation into her sister's death, going over how she had to fight for rights in the case and demand a cold case unit in New Hampshire. I will put a link to Karen's webpage on my Sipping on Some Crime page so you can check out the site and both of her books. Karen and her sisters have done so much to fight for their sister. It's truly inspiring. I definitely recommend checking out the site. Throughout the years, there was a number of suspects, but there was not enough evidence to make a case on any of them. The years went by and there was no movement on the case until March 2006. A 63-year-old man came into the Dixie County Police Department in Florida saying he needed to make a report. This man was Edward Earl Duquette. Ed began telling Detective Miller about a young girl he took fishing over 30 years ago. At one point, he says they were heavy petting, and then he said he realized she was suddenly dead, and he put her in his trunk and he buried her. He was jumping all around, jumbling facts. The timeline didn't make sense. Even with Ed's story seeming jumbled and out of order, Detective Miller asked Ed if he could record his confession, and he agreed.
State your full name and date of birth, please.
Edward Duquette.
And you came to get something off your mind that's been bothering you for 30 years, and it involves death in New Hampshire. Do you remember the name of the girl?
It was Gloddy.
Was her first name Kathy?
Yes. Well, I had taken this little girl fishing, and something happened, and I found the little girl in the water.
Major Miller decides he needs to call the New Hampshire State Police. He was put in touch with Officer Scott Gilbert. Miller let Gilbert know that a man just wandered off the street into his office claiming to be responsible for a young girl's murder in New Hampshire 30 years ago. After hearing what Major Miller had to say, the New Hampshire police booked a flight to Florida right away. When New Hampshire officers arrived in Florida to speak with Duquette, he was all of a sudden backtracking on his statements and refusing to come in to meet with the officers. Ed tells the officers he was confused due to a recent spinal tap and new medication, and that he must have seen a movie that made him think these things. With Ed refusing to come in and meet the New Hampshire detectives, they had to fly home without being able to interview him. With Ed now backtracking on his statements, Franklin investigators had to again take a fresh look at this case, and this time, look into Ed Duquette's past and where he was when Kathy was murdered. While investigating Ed and digging through his past, they discover something that would change the whole projection of the investigation and shock everyone. In 1971, Edward Duquette, then 28, had actually been living in Franklin during the time Kathy was murdered, and he lived a lot closer than investigators would have ever predicted. In fact, Franklin was Ed Duquette's hometown. He was born and raised in Franklin. The Gloddy family rented out apartments in their home, and in 1971, Edward Duquette was living in the upstairs apartment with his wife and young child. The same year that Kathy was killed, Earl Gloddy, Kathy's father, sat on the jury of a case of a man accused of statutory rape. Earl and the other jurors found the man guilty. That man was Earl Duquette, Ed Duquette's father. After Earl Gloddy put together that Earl was Ed's father, he evicted Ed and his family from the apartment. I cannot find anywhere what led Earl Gloddy to making that decision, whether it was something he heard in court or the fact that he just didn't want anyone associated with that man around. I'm not sure, but he did evict Ed just a few months before Kathy's murder. Armed with this new information, investigators spoke to Karen and her sisters, wanting to know if they remembered an Edward Duquette. Karen said instantly it clicked, and a memory she had buried so deep came to the surface. Karen remembers Ed, his wife, and young child living above them, because like I stated earlier, she or one of her sisters would babysit for them. Karen tells the officers of the last interaction babysitting for him and why the girls never went back. Karen said that the last time she came to babysit the little one, Ed was there with his wife when she first arrived. Ed's wife got ready and left, leaving her alone with Ed and the small child. Within moments of his wife leaving, Ed grabs Karen, picks her up, and takes her into the bedroom, where he attempts to sexually assault her. But she gets out of the room and leaves the house before anything can happen. She came home and she said nothing. She didn't tell her parents. Karen says it's because you just didn't do that in the 70s. You just didn't say something like that. Investigators also discovered that Ed was living in California just a few months before Kathy's death and had ran back home to Franklin, New Hampshire, because he was facing charges for raping a 14-year-old girl who lived in his neighborhood in Gardena, California. In July 1971, the 14-year-old girl came over to Ed's house under the guise of a babysitting job. However, once she arrived, he grabbed the young girl, detained her, and repeatedly raped her for over a day and a half before finally letting her go. That young girl reported everything to her mother, and her mother called the police right away. Ed fled the area before he could be arrested and back home to Franklin with his wife and young child, renting an apartment from the Gloddy family. When we take in this information and we look at the violence of Kathy's death, the overkill of violence, the repeated rape, things start to line up. Now you have a man who's been accused before of raping young girls repeatedly, a man who's been evicted and whose father was sentenced for rape after that man sat on that jury and helped deliver that guilty verdict. The last victim he let go went to the police, so he couldn't risk that again. Investigators pick up on Duquette's record in 1972 in Texas, where he's arrested for the California rape charges. He is extradited back to California in 73 and sentenced 5 years in prison. They discovered that was not his first conviction. Edward Duquette's record shows that at June 1st, in 1969, Ed is charged with an attempted rape of a 14-year-old girl. He pled guilty and was sentenced to a minimum of 1 year in 1 day with a maximum of 3 years in a New Hampshire prison. He served a short sentence and was out and on his way to California by July. By that time, he had actually raped a young girl. So we can see a pattern here, and it's escalating quickly. After serving his last prison sentence, we don't see or hear much of anything from him. That is until Edward Duquette walks into the Dixon County Police Station to confess. Now New Hampshire investigators had a timeline. They had a motive, and they had witnesses that could place Ed and Franklin in November on into December. One witness, a man who said he had traveled to Franklin with Ed, told police about how they called him Dirty Eddie, and that he was generally really rough with women. Investigators had Kathy's body exhumed in 2006 to be examined by a forensic anthropologist, and based on their findings, they were now armed with a better picture of what happened to Kathy that day. With the knowledge about the past convictions and new interviews with witnesses and associates of Ed, the New Hampshire police felt like they had a pretty good picture of the type of guy Ed was when he was living in Franklin. And now they knew how they were going to approach him and get him to start talking. New Hampshire State Police officers bought their tickets to Florida and arranged to meet up with Dixon officers and bring Duquette in for an interview. New Hampshire State Officer Scott Gilbert told 2020 that he remembers having the plane tickets to fly back to Florida in his hands to interview Ed, when suddenly a call came in that Ed had passed away. August 13, 2009, just 3 years after walking into the Florida Police Department to confess being involved in Kathy Gloddy's death, Edward Duquette would die in hospice from lung and liver ailments, but not before finding God. Friends and neighbors say Ed had a huge copy of the 10 Commandments on his front lawn in front of his trailer in Florida. He was very involved in his church and had remarried and had more children. The investigating officers now think that Ed walked into the station that day looking to clear his conscience or for some type of redemption before he died from cancer. Kathy's murder investigation is still open today, with so many unanswered questions. Were there others involved? And if so, are they still in Franklin? New Hampshire police still have a list of 15 other people of interest. Karen doesn't believe he did this on his own and thinks there were others involved. Karen traveled to Florida to speak with Ed's wife after his death in hopes that if she knew anything, if he had told her something, that now in his passing, she would share. Karen remarks how she could tell that his wife really loved him and that she was in her own deep grief. Karen was upfront telling Ed's wife that she had the right to her grief, but what Ed did to her sister was horrible and unforgivable. Ed's wife tells Karen how she believes it's her fault that he backtracked on his statement. She told Karen how Ed came home and told her that he had just confessed to having knowledge about the murder of this little girl and that he was involved. Right away, she told him that it couldn't be true. It just couldn't be. It must be his meds. She tells him that she knows that he's very sick and confused and must understand that as sick as he is, if he goes to prison, they couldn't care for him like she would. Ed was very ill at the time, and the thought of that did frighten him. So that's when he decided to backtrack and go silent. Ed's wife said that as he aged, he did have an awful fear of being put in a nursing home. He made his wife promise to never put him in a home, so the idea of jail was even worse. Karen left Florida asking his wife, "Please, if you think of anything that could help solve my sister's murder, I hope that you would tell investigators." Karen let Ed's wife know that her and her sisters were not going to stop, that this wasn't just going to go away until Kathy had the justice that she deserved. Karen believes that Ed was trying to do the right thing in the end, to clear his conscience before dying, but ultimately was too afraid to face the consequences and took those secrets with him to the grave. Kathy's sisters will never stop fighting for her justice, and they will never stop fighting for cold case funding. They don't want another family to go through the decades of pain that they have faced due to the lack of cold case units. In 2009, Janet and Karen took their fight to the Senate floor. They fought for Bill 130, which would add 2 attorneys to the now 1-serving cold case unit for a total of 3. July 30th, 2009, John Lynch and the Gloddy sisters signed into law Bill 130. I recommend looking more into this case if you're interested. Like I mentioned before, they do believe that there could have been more suspects involved in Kathy's murder. When you're researching this case, you'll come across quite a few different stories. There's one about a salesman that had lived in the area that apparently changed his tires the very next day after they discovered Kathy's body. There's also mention that there are 3 other girls around the same area during 1969 to 1971 that had died in the same manner close to Kathy's, and that maybe a person or a group is responsible. So there's some very interesting theories out there, but I think if you're interested, you should definitely dig deeper into it. If you want to know more about Kathy's case today and what her family is doing and what they've gone through, I highly recommend you going over to Karen's site. I will provide that link on my webpage. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm learning this whole podcasting thing, so bear with me. I hope this first episode wasn't too awful with the audio. Next time, remember, when you're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, share those faces. It takes 1 second to retweet it or to hit that share button on Facebook. Help these families out. Every single tweet and share is so important to helping solve these cases and getting the case the exposure they need. Until next time.